And so now I'd like to hand it over to Maya and Matthew Gonzalez from Reflection Press. We're very excited to have you both here today. And I just want to thank you so much for this presentation.
Thank you. I'm super excited to be here. Let me get my screen share going and we're going to fly into action. All right. And I'm going to go pretty quickly through this first part to kind of keep us on time a little bit. And because some of it was kind of touched on some. All right. So just to begin with, always I want to acknowledge we are on a lonely land. Y'all are in Alameda, I think most of you. I'm over here in San Francisco. We can see here the different mapping through the Bay Area. And I always acknowledge this. I live within view of the Basilica. And so it's a constant reminder of the people who came here first and how we came through and took it away. So with that, we begin, and this is actually quite relevant to the stories that I'm going to be telling, which is why I keep it in mind so much. So blessings to all of the land that we are on and the people that have brought it into our awareness. So we're going through a three-step process. And I want to say right off the bat that this is a very distinct and different way of looking at gender. This is a nature-based, decolonized, holistic way of looking at gender. So it's different than a lot of ways that people talk about. We really get underneath the gender story and have that bigger perspective. So it begins with creating a foundation of nature-based. We're going to look at the patterns of nature, and then we go into the decolonized piece. Like that's really great information, but if we don't understand how that information has been suppressed and manipulated and distorted and the kind of impact it's had on us, we don't really know how to interpret that information fully. And then we finally come into a holistic perspective of gender, which allows us to see that whole way of looking at things and come into a nature-based way of looking at things, how to allow that to affect our mind and how we act or function in the world. All right, we're going to have breakout groups. You can always pass. I'm going to go through this really quickly. The confidentiality piece, active listening. It's really great to have pen and paper on hand if possible. I also encourage groups to have one person to share out so that we can hear from everybody, but in a more concise way. Uh, Also, feel free to use the chat to ask questions. If you have questions that you want to ask, but you don't necessarily want them tied to you, feel free to do a direct message and we'll share that question out because we want all questions to get asked. Like, don't be afraid of asking anything. That's really what this is for. We'll have PDFs of the tips and references to download, and we'll have links to those at the end of the training. If you're using this for educational or personal use, that's fantastic. If you're going to use it beyond that, do contact us. I want to share really quickly that I use umbrella terms and concepts. One of the main things I talk about, I say queer, trans, intersex a lot. QTI, queer, trans, intersex. And I use those big umbrella terms because there are so many terms underneath each of those and because the terms change so often. And we will be talking about bodies. And a lot of times for people within the community, this can be triggering. And so I do have warnings about that as we go. All right. So who am I? I am Maya Gonzalez. I'm a Chicanx genderqueer femme with a huge amount of experience documenting, doing research around LGBTQ history in all these different ways. I'm also a multicultural children's book maker. I've been in the industry for a really long time. I started off as a fine artist. My partner, Matthew, who you will see sneak in once in a while, does everything behind the scenes. We co-founded Reflection Press, which you will see our books down here at the bottom, a POC, queer and trans owned indie press. And as parents, we started really creating these books and wanting to have something that we could share our community with our kid. In a way that felt really expansive and again, nature-based, right? This very distinct perspective. And what is the gender wheel? The gender wheel is an educational tool. You can see it here. It's also an approach. It's a concept, a symbol. And so this first part is really this reorientation towards the gender wheel and what it is here to teach us. I consider it one of my greatest teachers, and I was the one that created it in 2010. But it's a very deep and profound symbol that allows us to expand our way of thinking and also understand the world better. So everything begins with the nature base. And you will see this triangle as we go through the next 3 sessions together on Wednesdays. And we begin here at the foundation where we really start to understand what is going on with nature. We will then look at what has been overlaid onto nature, right? We will look at the origins of oppression, the tools of oppression, and how this has impacted how we see the world, how we see ourselves, and how we really understand gender at the moment within this system, right? And then finally, having all of this within our perspective, we can really bring in a holistic way of looking at gender so that we have all of the pieces interacting together, right? And this is something that we'll find we kind of process through over and over and over to train our minds toward a holistic framework. So to begin with, I want to invite everyone, wherever you are, whatever you're doing, I always say, feel your weight. Slow down a bit. Okay. I was trying to speed through this first part to get on time. I will try to slow down now. So feel your weight. This is the perfect time. I always say this is gravity, is parent Earth reminding us that we belong here. So take a moment to just feel that gravity, that belonging, right? You can close your eyes if you want to. And I just want all of us to be present here in the moment. So I'm going to call all of us in. So I call my power in from the north and the south. I call my power in from the east and the west. I send my love up into the sky and I send my love down into the earth. May I be in right relationship to myself first and foremost. May I be in right relationship to all beings here in this perfect moment where I belong. Okay, so from this place, let us begin. So we're going to start off, like I said before, with the body and gender patterns of nature. So really establishing this foundation. So we're going to actually take a moment to pause and look, just think about for a second the kind of patterns that we actually see in nature. And here, our ancient ancestors, and this isn't a local thing, this isn't an isolated thing, this is across the globe. Our ancient ancestors were really aware of these patterns. We can see it in their architecture, in their understanding of reality, in the number of body types that they have in their literature and their documenting in art, in their medicine. So this idea of these sacred patterns flowing throughout nature can be seen in all of these different ways. We have, of course, I think it was Leonardo da Vinci who did the classic thing of looking at the body in relationship to these patterns. You can even see it in the hand, how it curls up, in the foot, like everywhere across the body, through plants, through the cosmos, through how patterns of weather occur. Like they're always these same ways, right? And so these patterns establish this concept that there is this way that nature behaves, the way that it shows up, the way that it is physically manifested throughout the world. And we see this quite literally through all physical beings, beginning quite literally with plants. Now we have this whole array here of these different plants. I'm going to start off with the tree. This is a 3,000-year-old tree, and it's been sexed because it's so old. They take care of it. They pay extra attention to it. It's been sexed over the centuries, I guess, always as a male. And what it did recently is it had these 3 berries show up out of nowhere, which is quote unquote a female trait. The way we talk about plants is the same way we talk about all living beings, is this male female sort of binary, right? This reproduction framework. Um, so we see even with plants, this like expansion and shifting with the papaya, the mango, and the rose. These are all what we call hermaphrodites, right? They have both male and female ways that they reproduce. Sometimes this is on the same plant. They have these different abilities. Sometimes it's between plants, but they like shift and move around. And then we see with the fungi, this is actually, these are like magic. These are even beyond plants. These have up to 26,000 different body types so that they can reproduce literally with almost any other kind of body type, right? So right off the bat, from this very simple place of having a reproduction style and a body style, we see that plants also will use as many different varieties and ways of being in their bodies and how they reproduce to fulfill sort of their capacity, everything that is available to them. And this continues on through nature. We see it first in like water things, right? This is where there's quite literally a lot of fluidity. And this is like the coral begins with this is actually multiple beings in one place, and they will have all these different styles of bodies so that they can reproduce either again within their own body or cross with other bodies. Then we start seeing intersex where there's these different ways that beings change. So clownfish, well, actually, if the primary female passes, dies, then the primary male will then step in and transition their body to become the female. We see this with the sheep's head wrasse in a different form, where they actually all begin as female bodies, and then at a certain age, all transition to male bodies, right? With the snail, they have both in them at the same time, where they can have this conversation when they meet another snail about who will play sort of this reproductive role and who will play this other reproductive role. With the whiptail lizards, they actually are all female bodies. So they procreate without having sexual intercourse at all. They still have sexual contact, but they don't need it to reproduce. And then I have the bear here. We have ancient stories. A lot of times people will say, oh, well, this is something in the water. This is something new. But we actually have ancient indigenous stories of bears that were called male mothers, where they would actually give birth through a phallus, right? So all these different body types, including this row at the bottom that are gynandromorphs. So they actually have this combination that is visible, where you can see what was contributed from the male, what was contributed from the female, and how they hold that in their bodies. And a lot of times there'll literally be this split down the middle where you can see, oh, this side is the female and this side is the male. Now, this doesn't happen in humans, right? Gynandromorph things in humans will be like your heart could be all female and the rest of your body could be all male genetically, right? So we see as many different varieties of body types, right? And how those bodies then reproduce in nature. And this continues. It's not just body types, right? It continues to also behavior and presentation, how one looks. So we see here all these different ones. I think the deer is one that's very interesting. A lot of times during deer season, I lived in Oregon, a lot of times people would shoot a doe unbeknownst to them because it had a rack. A lot of times we have this very binary idea like, oh, only male deer have a rack. But the reality is that a lot of female deers also have racks, right? And then we have the black maned lion off to the side, which is one of my favies. And this is this actually a herd of black male maned lions in Africa. All of them would be assigned female at birth, but they have these huge manes. And the darker the mane, supposedly, the more virile, right, in quote unquote male lions. And these lions don't just look like the other lions that are assigned male at birth. These assigned female lions also have behaviors where they roar really loud and resonant. They even have a harem of other female lions, just like those that are assigned male. So not only are they having the presentation and the look, but also their behaviors. So that this isn't just a body experience that nature shows us. This is also extends into what we would call trans behavior currently. And then we see this throughout global history, right? So then we ground this in the human animal. And I wanted to give this first piece where we show across the globe. So again, this isn't isolated to one place. This is literally all animals. This is human nature, right? This is the way, I'm so sorry, I'm going fast. I'm going to try and slow down. This is quite literally human nature, where we see all of these different beings, all of these different personalities throughout all of these different countries, all of these different areas across the globe, and how they then don't fall into traditional stereotypical ideas that we currently have about what gender looks like and how you're supposed to behave, right? So we have kings that are assigned female at birth. We have kings that spend time with their harem, doing what are usually considered female assigned tasks like spinning thread and wanting to hang out in different areas that are not what they're normally assigned to, like the war. Ashurbanipal was actually known for being really aggressive and violent, but in their private life, actually spent time wearing gowns and hanging out, like I said, spinning thread. And again, we see this through these other stories. And that this isn't just from the ancient past, that this is also, of course, and not just from current people, right? This is throughout US history. And I want to pause for a moment with public universal friend. And I think it's interesting to pay attention to when they were born and when they were reborn. They were reborn in 1776. And this is somebody who was born assigned female, right, at birth, but they went through a near death experience. And when they came out of it, it was actually very short. They became very, very sick, almost died, and then came out of it and said, "Oh my God, I'm reborn." In 1776, a very noteworthy year for this country, right? And they said, "I am free of gender. I am no longer male or female. I am simply public universal friend." And they changed their name to that. And what was so cool is that they had been born to a Quaker family, and they continued this as part of their ministry, in a sense, being this public universal friend, eradicating gender, and really seeing their self as free from these confines and projections. And they had a pretty good following. And what's interesting is that they were a threat, of course, to the other organizations around religion. And so they ended up in legal battles and this and that. And yet, their organization, their ministry endured literally until a few decades ago. So we see, again, all of these different people throughout all of these different walks of life who are expanding beyond gender stereotypes and roles. We see this again, and this endures to this time as well across the globe. Gender expansive roles within the ancient divines. This was seen in the different deities, but also in the different social roles, different ways that people were expanding into the community and how they took care of different things that were seen as sacred ways to contribute. Excuse me. I want to focus for a second here on this goddess great mother tradition, right? This was something that was very prominent, where literally the idea of nature was perceived as a female person, and how that was fertile and expansive and really creative, right? But that this also extended into their devotees, who were very often queer, trans, intersex people, right? Devotees who then were an extension of all of this exuberant diversity within nature. So almost the human nature, right? So we have the female as the expansion of all of nature, and then the queer, trans, intersex reminding us of human nature, that this is how we all behave, right? So this becomes important as we start to see a shift later on. And how this is not something that was completely abolished, as we hear attempts later on too, but this is something we see echoes of in our current time, across, again, the globe, in indigenous cultures that still hold on to pre-colonial ways of how human nature then expands. So we have the Mushe in Mexico, the Fa'afafina in Samoa, right? We have Hawaii, Indonesia, Thailand, North America, India, Pakistan, all of these communities that endure to this day, that have revered positions for third and fourth genders. So what this does, this like sweep through, and sorry it went so quickly, because there are literally thousands and thousands of stories in both nature and throughout cultures in our world, right, that show all of this diversity, all of this variety, all of this wholeness when we see everything together. And we have to actually see everything together. We have to understand all of these pieces to make the connection that there are these universal patterns of body, gender, and relationship diversity, right? What we found, somebody did the math, Joan Roughgarden did the math, actually, a trans white professor whose work I use quite a bit. And they did the math based on Darwin's statistics of like, well, if it happens this much, it means this. And so when they used that and looked at the prevalence of queer, trans, intersex people amidst humans, what they found is that the numbers quite literally show us that it's so high that it can only be seen as necessary and valuable to the species, right? That when we see the whole of the species, this is necessary to the resilience and endurance of a species. We see it not only in humans, but across all species. So, where we end up landing when we look at all of this diversity, right, and all of this wholeness, what we understand is that the body essentially, and we will look at this much deeper later, the body is essentially intersex, right? There, and when we see the wholeness of all bodies, the basis, the foundation of bodies is intersex. The foundation of relationships is actually pansexual. And gender is actually based on balance and fluidity, right? That diversity across all realms of nature allow for constant nuanced balancing of bodies and relationships that's necessary to successfully sustain life on earth, right? So it's part of that mystery of nature that keeps things flowing in ways so big we can't fully understand it. So the big question becomes why? If our ancient ancestors clearly knew about this, right? About the nature of humans, why has all of this been suppressed and distorted? Like most of us, I know I have it, and I think literally almost everyone I know have been taught in these very distinct ways that all this abundant diversity has to fit into these two tiny boxes of male and female, right? Well, why don't we know about this? Where did these boxes come from and why, right? So these are the questions that compelled me. And this is why we're getting underneath the gender conversation, right? We're going to the deeper source. So now that we have this deeper foundation of nature, we're going to look at how this got played out, like what got laid on, really piled on top of nature and why and how that functioned, right? So let's set the stage to begin with. To start with, what kind of cultures rose from this kind of knowing, this kind of full knowledge, right, of nature's diversity? Well, actually, they were egalitarian, something we don't hear about a whole lot. They had communal property, peaceful sharing, nature based, obviously, indigenous, intuitive, spiritual. These are some of the words that came up as I studied these cultures and looked at them. You know, they were about wholeness, about inclusion, because they focused on nature. They had a high esteem for people that were assigned female, and they frequently revered queer, trans, intersex people, right? That's why those were an extension, literally, of human nature, right? Of how we are a part of this bigger thing. And everything was sacred, everything was alive, had spirit, right? This pagan idea. And you can see this art piece that I did next to it from an old uh, talk that I gave, where I'm really giving this embodiment, like this fluid, growing, right? And what happened is because of this, they had a matrilineal framework. So sometimes people say, well, the past, there was no matriarchy. And it's like, that's right. There was no matriarchy. There was no power dominance because things were egalitarian. What we have was matrilineal. So this is where female bodies were really revered. They had the power, right, to choose their own sexual partners, to separate from their own sexual partners, had complete control over their body, whether they wanted to stay with family and community when they had a child. Children were perceived through who gave birth to them, right? And they saw bodies, both male and female bodies, as linked. They didn't see them as separate in any way. They were part of the wholeness, part of the continuum. It was an earth, body, nature focus, right? So, what interrupted this? What changed things after thousands and thousands of years? How did things change? So, I'm that nerd that loves to do tons of research. And what I think happened was this huge, devastating process about 12,000 years ago. I think this was the end. It signifies where things really started to shift, where everything died off all of a sudden. And it really shocked not only the planet with this mini ice age that just appeared out of nowhere, it literally happened overnight, they say. It killed off all the megafauna, all kinds of fauna. It wiped out the whole a community that was here in North America. And it didn't last for just a short time. It lasted for 1,300 years. So I feel it was this way that was almost like nature for some beings may have felt like it had almost turned on them, where everything changed and became harsh and inhospitable. And what I think happened is that it triggered this very deep survival strategy. I think initially it probably was like, well, let's protect the egg. Let's protect those who give birth, right? How do we like continue the process? How do we continue the species under such difficult circumstances? And so I think this protect the egg came from an originally a very nature-based, very thoughtful place. But I think over time, because of this huge trauma of this ice age and the devastation, I feel that the fear in a number of isolated places across the planet triggered this survival strategy that in time would only turn into control the egg, right? Control those who contain, so control females, right? And that this, in order to protect the egg, I have to control it. And I think this is where things really shifted. So, in order to control the egg, we have to find who the patrilineal version is. And I think this is where patriarchy first really started getting hold. I have to have full control of that female body in order to protect it, right? And I think this sets up the whole thing about nature is something to control, which we will see how that plays out later. So, control the egg. This is, I think, historically one of the main things that really starts shifting us away from this nature-based framework. So again, isolated pockets this occurred in, but these pockets developed, and I focus a great deal on Rome, a lot of my research, because this is where that patriarchy, that patrilineal, that really focused on the male dominance took root and created its own empire, and it began to expand. And so this, of course, naturally came into conflict, cultural conflict, but then also power conflict, political conflict with all of the old ways of thinking, that old, even human nature, right, that was tied to all of that. So all of that, that were the priestesses, that were the mother nature, you know, embodied everything that was nature, that was fertile, that was dark and sacred, right, that was birth, death, all of that. All of that was had gained political and cultural power, including the queer, trans, intersex devotees, the priestesses of these cults, right? So this was a whole way that had established the culture. So all of that, as the empire grew, it had to come into conflict with that. And what the empire did, what the patriarchy did was brilliant, is they were like, we need to find a spiritual practice that can compete basically with all the spirituality and all of the root core power of mother nature, right, of the priestesses, of all of this mother goddess kind of framework. So what they did is they focused on the different cults that they saw going on, and they actually handpicked Christianity at the time, which is very diverse and wild. But they chose a particular sect of it that was very organized, very patriarchal in a lot of ways. And they really like took that and then again handpicked very specifically the things that would support what was their goal for the empire and patriarchy. So they created what was called the Catholic Church, which quite literally means universal, because they wanted to create a form of Christianity that they could force on the people, basically, right? All of this is very like military based, very urban, very different than sort of the rural, right? The goddess, the nature based. So we see this conflict, and what ended up happening, of course, is that Christianity, Catholicism, and the Roman Empire patriarchy eventually ended up devouring through very, very violent waves all of the goddess, the mother nature, the pagan, that nature was sacred, queer, trans, intersex, part of being human nature. All of this got really politically demonized, for one, right? As well as morally condemned through the Catholic Church. So we really see set up this like this spiritual, this religious kind of condemnation, as well as this political condemnation, which we can continue to see to this day, because this is quite literally the origins of it, right? Um, and so this was really about, what was ironic is that Rome fell, but Catholicism continued on, right? It became a political, spiritual, religious power in the culture. And as it continued to basically control and take over Europe and expand through Europe, it wasn't enough to just like be able to control like females and then control human nature, right? You can't be queer, trans, intersex. You can't believe in nature. Then became the next piece, right? So they had to control any kind of nature-based thought. So this meant that they had to eradicate any kinds of ways that people thought that were still connected to nature. And I have this black cat here because black was quite literally a sacred color. It had to do with death, it had to do with rebirth, it had to do with birth, it had to do with the dark wood, it had to do with those places of the unknown, of the night, right? So black became this whole, anything that was dark was considered bad. It had to be demonized. And then they would project this onto nature as much as possible. So quite literally, cats became considered evil, and black cats in particular. So we can see this beginning of projecting anything that's dark onto nature and then demonizing it and thinking that it's bad. And then as a result, they ended up actually having laws where you had to kill all black cats. And then that extended to killing all cats, right? And what this did is it set up the plague, which cats kill rats, and the rats was carried by the fleas that had the plague. So it was this interruption of nature, and then how that impacts sort of like how things flow, and then how this extended onto the people. All right. So we see this intense violence and all this destruction, all this ancestral trauma as they separate, as the patriarchy, this very urban, right, perspective starts separating people from nature. And we start to see these really profound, deep cultural shifts. So before, where we saw this egalitarian culture that was really the framework that's tied to nature, where there was communal, equitable, they literally didn't have anything that was significant kind of combat. They didn't have anything that was known as war. They didn't have fences. They would have disagreements at times, but there wasn't this like organized conflict that was constantly going on. It would be very like isolated, right? And we move into this more urban, more patriarchal, more mental, more military, right? This is about power. This is about power over. This is about things being away from nature. So it's more like in the mind. And it really then has to control the mind. And really, in order to do that, right, to suppress any kind of deeper understanding or knowledge of nature, so that they suppress and control females, female bodies, and even queer nature, like queer, trans, intersexness, right? So we see this huge shift in values. And I focus on Europe in particular because this was quite literally what was picked up and carried to the Americas, which is where we are now, of course. So I wanted to understand those deeper stories about how come we lost everything? Why was that? How did they use this? So these ideas about darkness being bad, nature being bad, queer, trans, intersexness being bad. This was literally projected then onto the indigenous people of the Americas, and they were seen as demons, as evil devils, right? Everything they did, the fact that they were even following human nature was conceived as really, really bad. So much so that they were like, oh, we have to destroy this before it can even be documented, right? All they could see was like queerness and nature and, being connected to nature. This had to be ruined, right? And so this was how they really attacked. They used this to justify really aggressively colonizing the people here, really destroying everything. And this clearly set up a pattern for the Americas, for the United States, then to also come here and do the same thing. And we see this pattern of control kind of accelerate as it happens. I was thinking, it's like, well, why did it take such a long time? And it's like things happen so fast now. It's because we have the internet. We can talk to each other globally in moments. Whereas before it was really like it would take very long periods for change to pass. But as we see, the more control steps in, the easier it is to set in more and more control. So that when we really break it down, we can see that control the female, control human nature, control indigenous thought, really control darkness, now has moved into control the world until it becomes quite literally internalized, where we now control ourselves, right? So this idea of internalizing all of this over time, this control. So it has changed everything. So how things used to be, the way people used to think, is now completely shifted. And now we're left with these core falsehoods instead of core truths. So man over woman, there's only two sexes, there's only two genders, queer, trans, intersex people are wrong and bad, man over nature, and even humans have different value based on skin color, right? And then this continues to trickle down, right? The control just like gets more and more like body size, body ability, right? Disability, all of that stuff. So now we can see that this nature, we saw nature and how cool and diverse and various it is. And then we saw the origins of oppression, right? That political, that turned religious, so it turned moral, right? Way that that got pressed down, demonizing nature. And then the tools of oppression, right? How do we start really like making it so it's politically, right? All of this is bad. How do we put everything down? And how do we keep everything down to this full extent, to the point that it's internalized? So we're going to look at that for a moment. So how did this play out on the body? Well, initially, our ancestors actually a long time ago were really expanded and had this understanding that there was this core body type and that there were all these variations based on that core body type, right? Which is actually very scientifically valid that we're going to find out later on. As the patriarchy came forward, they had to suppress that, right? So they quite literally took nature and almost did the opposite. They like did this really immature thing where they just like took the female power that's there and they replaced it with the male on top of it. And it's like, okay, all bodies are male, is how they started seeing this. Like the Greeks and the Romans saw all bodies as male and saw female bodies in this really weird way. They called it inverted. They're like inside out male bodies, right? Was how they saw it and how they then taught it. So obviously they were like getting everything wrong medically, scientifically, like all the stuff about how to treat those bodies was wrong. Eventually that became too much and they're like, no, these two bodies, they can't even be the same body inside out. They're two completely separate bodies. These are this one kind of body and then this totally other kind of body, because obviously male bodies are so far superior that they are dominant over these far inferior female bodies. Like those are accidents, those bodies are wrong, right? Even though those are the bodies that actually give birth to the male bodies, right? So this is how the perception of body started changing. So simultaneously, there's all these social roles, right, that are getting played out to maintain that, right? So these social roles have to consistently portray that as real, right? So the core falsehood has to be seen as true, even though it's not. So it's no longer about patrilineal or protect the egg, right? This is about political power, privilege, and eradicating the threat. So now that they've established all this privilege, they have to basically eradicate anything that would threaten that privilege on top of it. So this cements these power structures into place, right? So all of this control starts being very put into multiple areas of how everything works. And what they do is they start really separating and exaggerating these two ideas of what these bodies look like and literally creating what we consider these boxes, these stereotypes that are supposed to fit. So that the males now, we only perceive and exaggerate and focus on them being active, big, strong. They go out, they do the work, right? And then the females are these little tiny, thin, passive, small, weak, right? Stay home, have babies. That's their goal, right? And any kind of similarity is voided. Any kind of difference that adheres to this is exaggerated, right? Now there's correct performance, right, that gets rewarded based on that. And any kind of incorrect performance that doesn't buy into that, right, is punished, sometimes really aggressively, sometimes by death. And queer, trans, intersex people are quite literally erased, right? So these social roles start embedding into the bodies. They become so tied in, the oppression, the core values are so false. This becomes so that we now think that these roles actually rise from the body, right? So that they're actually inherent. So we start getting this idea that there's this biological gender that's occurring when actually there's not. There's this continuum, right? So there's this complete separation from and control of nature, right? But this is not reflective. These little boxes, as male and female, does not actually show that wild diversity that we understand now is actually necessary to maintain balance, right? But we've all been trained now into these boxes. We're all oppressed by these boxes. So one of the ways that we start beginning to heal from this, to start shifting this, is to begin acknowledging these boxes, to start saying that we have been trained into this false sense of these two little boxes, right? Female assigned bodies do not behave like this exclusively. Male bodies do not behave like this exclusively, right? We call this, when we talk to kids in our house, the girl boy lie, where we start really expanding into infinity. Anything that boxes in is a lie, right? And to acknowledge that there's this constant stress to perform to gender stereotypes, that we have to hold that into mind. We haven't gotten back into humanity until we can free ourselves from that. And that this mindset that separates from nature, this nature must be controlled, is where we're at right now. Oh God, I'm sorry. Um, that everything we're being taught in a sense is how do we control nature, and not just human nature, right? Not just the queer trans intersex thing, but quite literally all of nature, right? Humans have put ourselves in the position of being human centric, of being dominant to even animals, even though we are also an animal. And this has led us into this binary thinking, right? Into these opposites constantly, instead of what's actually natural, which are these patterns of circles and cycles and spirals and continuums that we will explore later on. And that this doesn't only affect how we think. Clearly, this has affected our language, how we talk, right? Quite literally, many, many words have been erased from the world over the centuries, where we used to have language to talk like this. So again, we want to remind ourselves is that nature is this huge, amazing, expansive thing and is literally not meant to fit into two boxes. That doesn't create the balance, right, that we need to be able to maintain in the world and to keep things flowing. So the impact of living inside of these boxes, this has shifted how we perceive ourselves, how we live in the world, right? So we want to understand that impact in order to fully receive this lesson. All right, so the boxes impact everything, how we everything we see, every like this is literally like glasses that we have on, how we see ourselves, how we see the world, how we see everything all the time. Um, and that what started changing things to get current was the world wars, to be perfectly honest. Is the First World War brought, especially like in the barracks, right, all the assigned males together, all the assigned females together, so the queer trans intersex people started connecting, started realizing, oh, I'm not alone, there's lots of us in the world, and so started creating community in a way like never before. I want to say that it wasn't as demonized in the World War I era, where there were literally pamphlets that the government was giving out to teach them how to do drag to entertain the troops, so that this gender non-conforming, this gender play was actually seen as a very positive thing for people. Eventually, when we start getting into World War II, this is shifting. Now it's like, okay, even though the straights originally liked going to queer events, liked seeing the balls, loved seeing the drag, right? Loved seeing all of this bending and expansion. And that was beautiful. That started being seen as a threat to the deeper system, the deeper organizations, the government, even, right? There was a huge lavender scare where they even like banned everyone. And as we know, our country loves eugenics. We love to decide what bodies are valuable because we're based in Western culture, right? We're based in patriarchy. So this judgment about what bodies, color, sex, right, behavior, all of this is how we judge and how we've eradicated large swaths of people. And so this got called in then in the 50s, really trying to understand, well, where is gender located? Where is queerness in the body, right? Where can we then isolate it so that we can, you know, use electric shock? We can use, how to cut it out, sterilize. How can we castrate? How can we isolate? So trying to even find a queer germ so that they can control this threat, to understanding that this is human nature, right? Um, and that this is how, from this environment and this way of thinking, and this impacted the medical world, the academic world, the psychological world, really. This impacted then how queer trans activists in the 70s were trying to make sense out of themselves. Oh, you divide the body up and you isolate the person and you divide them up, and that's how you can make sense out of humanity, right? Out of the human, with this really skewed right sense. And we see how this got played in. Queers keep trying to use this framework to find themselves, but that okay, so they can find themselves, but that this is based in this eugenic framework, right? This is based in this idea of isolation, of like dividing the body up and trying to fix or cure someone of something that is problematic to society, right? No matter how we try to shift that and reclaim it, the gender elephant, the rainbow person, right? So when we look at this closer, what we see again is always the isolation of the individual, right? And they're dividing the person into parts to make sense out of them. And it centers this binary linear perspectives, right? So how much, masculine are you? How much feminine are you? In these stereotypical frameworks, right? It cancels out all kinds of interconnectedness, where it's not seeing how those things play into each other and how they are integrated into oneself. Gender expression becomes tied to stereotypes and assumptions about what bodies are supposed to be like based on this faulty way of looking. And it was plagiarized quite literally by Sam Killerman, a cis straight white person who then uses white straight people as the center about how to understand, use this tool to understand humans, right? And they never give that larger context of nature. So within the current system, these concepts were a step to understanding gender for queer, trans, intersex people trying to use the tools that were available. But the sadness is that their origins are quite literally from academic and medical perspectives that are based on trying to actually fix humans and eradicate the human nature, right? How we behave. Um, what we have currently that gets played out a lot is a continuation of this, is almost the medicalization of politics in a way, where we kind of move into that more political social realm and we start looking at social constructs as a way to understand, gender. And we get caught, I think a lot of the current activism gets caught in education. Oh, well, if people just understood the definitions and the labels and the identity, that then they would understand and have greater acceptance. But that denies the root that this has been transformed at its origin into a moral and political issue, right? So we need to really kind of take it out of that and move it into the reality of nature. We can agree that it's a civil rights. I think this is where my work and a lot of the current activists where we meet is that this is a civil rights issue, but having to basically constantly argue that, I think is challenging. And I think we need to have something that almost steps us out of that, right? So that we get out of that original dynamic of, again, this being a political, moral issue. Okay. So, again, what I have found in order to understand this bigger story is not just the education piece, like what definitions, identities, right, labels do I need to get? We have to kind of understand the deeper thing that's going on, which means we have to get outside of the current culture and understand the constant pressure and why it's there to get people to conform to gender stereotypes, right? And how that impacts safety and privilege, right? These oppressive gender roles that's what's a social construct, right? There's no way that any body is meant to behave. Bodies are meant to be free. And gender is not something in your head. It's quite literally bigger than that. This is part of the mystery of nature that flows through all of us. And it can't be contained, something that big, part of the mystery of balancing nature into two binary, two tiny little boxes, right? That could never explain this bigger infinite reality of nature. And what we need, quite literally, are new frameworks, new narratives that include all people all the time, right? Okay. So hopefully I will continue. I'm so sorry that I'm talking fast. I forget that as I get going, part of it, I think, is I get so excited. But I want people to catch at least the main pieces. It's so important, and the spirit. So we're going to have a poll, our first poll, to just kind of get a sense, a read of where folks are. So to begin with, let's see, how familiar are you with the information and perspective you just heard? Great. And I think that's really important for me to hear too, because a lot of this has been more accessible to folks about history, about animals, even. But a lot of it is still just kind of coming forward, and we're not having ways to organize it or synthesize it to make sense out of it, which is where the gender wheel and the approach really help. I want to say too that it is actually super good to also see that folks also feel disoriented. This is part of it too. Matthew used to tell me when I would go out into the world and give these, tell folks, remember that feeling confused and disoriented is a good sign. It means that your mind could be expanding and you could be understanding things from a different place. This is a reorientation, right, for a lot of folks. And again, it belongs to everybody. This isn't something that should be hidden. This is something we want everyone to start understanding. Okay, so there's our results. It looks like a lot of folks are somewhat or not familiar, which is perfect. That's actually a sweet spot. All right, so now we're going to go into breakout groups. So you have a minute to kind of process through some of this. And again, feel free to have like one person come forward as your spokesmodel, so to speak. So what is a nature-based and decolonized perspective of gender diversity? Like, what are some of the things that are sticking out for you? And how is it different or similar to current perspectives you already may have about gender diversity, right? So kind of that contrast, look at them, compare and contrast.
Until 11:10.
And we're going to go until 11:10. So you'll have about 8 minutes to dive into that mystery. All right. Okay. All right. Well, I'm curious to hear if anyone has a spokesmodel that wants to share. I also wanted to say it like this is really new way of looking at things. And so actually not understanding or not knowing or being familiar with is really makes sense and is good, is part of why we want to kind of open up the conversation and be able to talk about it. So I love that part. All right, well, I'm going to give you another moment. I want to hear something, but if I don't hear anything, I'm going to dive in so that we can keep on track with our timing a little bit. All right, well, feel free to ask questions as we go or put even comments in the chat, and we can go from there. All right, and back we go into our story. All right, so that was a lot, and it's a lot of information. I totally get that. A reorientation, right? So now that we understand patterns of nature, sort of that bigger foundation that happens just across all living beings, and we start to understand what has been put on top of that, how we've been sort of like changed in our thinking over a long period of time, and then how that's even impacted how we think about gender and bodies now, and even nature, right? So we're going to start wandering our way into a bigger way of looking at things and how we can start making sense out of some of this. And I've spent the last over 15 years, and this has been, again, one of my biggest teachers where it's taken time for it to unfold and for me to even understand it more. I created it in 2010 because I had a 5 year old that I was parenting, and I couldn't find any really great books that talked about nature and gender in our community in a way that I liked. So I started sharing my own ideas and started off with a coloring book as a way to open it. And I introduced the gender wheel for the first time. And I started teaching it in different gender conferences and orgs. And then in 2017, I had another child that I was parenting, and they were turning 4. And actually, Matthew, my partner, it's our child, used the Gender Now coloring book as a way to be talking to our child and started using pronouns as a way to start making sense and expanding gender and ideas about bodies and people. And so we created the first pronoun book to start being able to talk to kids specifically. And the gender wheel we made into a slightly older kid book too, because my work was plagiarized at this time, which is mind boggling. I actually started trademarking my work and being more official about it. I feel because it is a sacred teacher that I want to be a respectful guardian. So I'm gonna play with this. I'm not gonna go into all the super big details of everything, but I want you to get the concepts, the bigger concepts. This is really important. And then actually next week on Wednesday, we're gonna look at the physical wheel. I don't know if you can see my tiny face, but we'll actually have an ed tool that will, I think, because it's physical and we can see how it moves and how to use it, I think makes understanding it even more easy. Because it's a symbol, it's quite literally a physical tool, but it's also a theory and an approach, right? So everything that we've been doing, how we've been looking at um, gender and nature is the whole approach of it being nature-based, decolonized, and holistic, really being the part, and how nature brings us all these different things, right? So we start really paying attention to patterns of nature, right? To the cycles and circles and the way things move, as well as the diversity. That the diversity is literally off the charts. I'm not even scratching even a fingernail of the kind of diversity that happens in nature. This is like amazing. And that what this does through all this diversity is it creates balance because everything is interconnected, right? So that they can have this way of being responsive to what needs to happen, and that it's always in community. Nothing is ever isolated, and that there's still so much that we don't know. So this is really embracing that aspect of nature, really like all of the pieces of it, and allowing that to inform us the way it did our ancestors, right? All of our ancestors. And then speaking of our ancestors, more of us have been decolonized more recently or colonized more recently than others. And so holding that in place, understanding what has been put over nature, and that again, this has happened to all of us as well, that in reality, there are no boxes, that nature is really about flow, not control. That control rises from the trauma that ended up coming up, right? And that we need to have that bigger context in order to understand what's happened, not only to nature, but also to ourselves, to our thinking, to the way we are like dynamics in the world, the way we interact with one another. So understanding this context, the history, how that this has played out, how this has changed how we talk, the level of words that have literally been erased from how many languages in order to control this idea of human nature, right? And that this has impacted that we don't think in holistic continuums anymore, that we've been trained to think in these like opposites, and almost like even us over them, kind of these power dynamics, that it's always this back and forth. It's never wholeness, it's never everyone together, it's never all of community, because what we really want is to come back into a holistic framework, which is nature, right? is the whole person in whole community, in all of nature, with all of human nature as well, right? And the whole story about what happened, including all the research, all the teaching, all the thinking to be able to be impacted, so that we're not hiding things anymore, that we're really pressing into the truth that's all around us, and how we can let that change how we think and how we are in the world. And why is this important, to working with kids? We're going to see how all of this shift in perspective is then played out through our teaching materials and how we teach, right? How we hold our bodies and even the nonverbal, right? And how we're holding that, because what are we really seriously wanting to bring our trans kids in the classroom, right? Is this bigger sense of self and belonging. So as I go through the gender wheel right now, I'm just going to touch on some of the concepts so that you can get a feel of it. And then next week, we're going to actually move it. If you want, you could create your own gender wheel over during the time in between. There's a paper download. But again, it's these bigger concepts I'm wanting you to hold on to. And then we'll get into the details next week, right? So it begins as a circle. We've seen it kind of the corner of our eye on a couple of the slides. And why is it a circle? A circle because circles have the ability to hold infinity. There is no end to how many points a circle can hold, right? So we want that kind of idea that this is holding everyone at once, right? All the concepts, all the ideas. And there's 4 circles. And so they're all nested inside of each other. So there's never any isolation, right? It's always more about this comfort, this coziness. And each of these circles is actually a continuum. We don't want spectrums. We hear a lot about gender spectrums, but the point really is that spectrums are still 2 points, right? And they're opening up that space in between. But if we're wanting to actually not have some point be like more important than another, if we're wanting all of the beings in this cycle, this all the points to be equal, no hierarchy, then a continuum allows us to establish that equality, as well as open up not things that are just in relation to these 2 opposites, but everything that's above in one way and everything that's below in another way. So all the variations, not only using those 2 points is kind of like how we determine, right? We're actually expanding our minds into other points. Um, I think this is a really important part, in part because we're also talking about dynamics. We're not wanting that power over, right? We're wanting everyone at the same time equally included, so that the symbol also shows us that. And that there's this flow that happens in a continuum, which is very nature based, right? So that you create a continuum by each thing being next to it is just a little bit different. Then the next one's a little bit different. The next one's a little bit different, until through having all that little bit of differences, you've actually included everyone. So you have people or pronouns or inside feelings, bodies, right? Placed on the wheel in such a way that we can actually see that continuum. We can actually see the connection between bodies and how they flow. Those connections flow through all bodies, all pronouns, all inside feelings. And so, what are those 4 circles? So, the very, very center one is a star. And it actually reminds us that we're all connected and we all come from the same place. I'm not saying what that place is, I leave that to each. But whatever that is, however we come through, wherever we were before we got here, wherever we go afterwards, it's all the same, right? We're all connected there. And then from there, we're born into a culture here. And so that's represented by the pronoun circle, that we're using that as a way to see, well, how far are we? Do we only have 2 pronouns? We're going to need at least 4 pronouns if we want to break down a binary, right? So the pronoun circle, it will be a continuum, right? And show all the different pronouns and how they're connected. Then we move to the inside feeling. And again, this is a symbol that can be used for any species. So we're not using words like gender at this point. We're not using words like identity. We're talking about an inside feeling, that this is true for deer, this is true for bears, this is true for humans, right? That there's a feeling that you have that can be seen. And when we put those in a continuum, we can see it shift from female through androgynous, all the different words we can use, but the concepts remain the same, over into what we could call masculine, into, again, non-binary, all the different words, back to female. And because it's a continuum, we can see how each of those is connected and how they flow through that bigger piece, right? And then the body, we will go into this actually with more detail. In fact, I think I might go to that one in particular so that we have a chance to look at the body circle. Because this one is really interesting in terms of breaking down ideas of the binary. Is the body quite literally, if you place the bodies in a continuum around the circle, and you have them just a little bit different around each way until we get all the way around, right? We can start to see the variation in how that flow happens. So it happens with the genes, right? And it also happens with how bodies look, or what's called the phenotype, right? And then also, we can divide it in these different ways. But what the body shows us is that we can actually never divide it into two. There's never, ever an actual binary in the body, right? So genotypes are how you divide things with genes. I include all of the intersex variations with the genes as well, so that we can see all of that, as well as all of the phenotypes, right? Through all of like trans, what we currently call cis, through intersex, and intersex female, what would often be called female bodies, and intersex male bodies. There's actually very, very rare, very, very rare that we have bodies that equally have both female and male genes or phenotypes, right? But what we find, without going through a lot of detail, is that if by chance we wanted to divide the bodies only by genes, let's say, and we put that line there, right? It would be the blue line, where we'd be like, okay, all the x, anything with an x is on this side, anything that has a y on it is on this side. You know, you would think surely we could divide the bodies into two and it would make sense to us in this binary way. But what we find is that if we include the phenotype line on here, which then would be the blue line, this beautiful window, it's the pink line. The pink line is the phenotype. So how bodies look, right? So if we lay that line on there, we get this beautiful window that shows up, which we would not have seen if we hadn't seen all bodies together at the same time, right? In this continuum. When we do that, we see this window where there are some bodies that would look like, have the phenotype look like, right, that they should be, quote unquote, should be assigned male at birth, but they would have the genes that would look like they should be assigned female at birth, right? And then you go across the other way and you see there are bodies that would have a look like they should be assigned the other way around. So what happens is that nature has made sure, right, and the beauty of it, that we never ever can actually physically divide bodies in two. And I think part of this is how bodies are made, is this nature base, right? When we start looking at that, what we actually start seeing is that bodies are this intersex base. So we all share all the same hormones, right? All bodies have all the same hormones to varying degrees, right? A continuum around the circle. And bodies all have an X in terms of genes. So there is always an X, is what we think of as assigned female. So when we think of our ancestors and what they knew about bodies, is that there's this one base body, and then there's all variations on that. That would be the X body. That would be the birthing body, right? So our ancestors in their nature-based framework actually understood a great deal about how to be present with what we are now seeing as scientifically true, right? So this is very interesting to kind of come back in alignment with that kind of understanding. So our ancient ancestors also understood that there were multiple body types, and most had a minimum of 6 body types, right? And we see this throughout all ancient cultures. All right, so Those are the basics of how things go. The relationship circle is not visible on this because I predominantly have focused on working with early childhood ed and kids just in general, right? And so we've been more focused on establishing that base body sense of self. But the relationship circle is coming out and will give that same idea about how we see all of these things interconnected and expand the conversation. So again, we see kind of this other way of perceiving gender that's not in isolation. It's not about dividing the body up, but seeing it nested together and how those interact. When we start playing with the actual ed tool, you'll get to see physically how those things go, but you can get a kind of sense of it here in this GIF off to the side, right? This is the very first gender wheel I created. I actually wood burned all of the details onto it. It was very challenging. So what does this do? What does it mean to kind of have this comparison back and forth? So we've been looking at gender within the system, right? We all have been experiencing gender within the system. So patriarchy is by definition based on gender oppression, right? So when we go through it, we begin reproduction is the primary frame, right? Which based on the story we've been hearing, that makes sense. Body and gender diversity then are a problem. It's about external authority and internalizing judgment, creating self-judgment. Everybody has to be assigned male or female, even if they're intersex, right? So this is actually very challenging for the intersex community. Both body identity and expression are expected all to align with this sex assignment has a gender assignment, right? So male bodies are supposed to act manly, female bodies supposed to act womanly. A sense of self is measured against these labels and how well you're measuring up to those, right? The genderbread model, which is what we have predominantly used, is based on dividing and isolating the self. So we don't want to see the self in context, right? We want to see the self alone so that we can control the narrative, right? And we can even divide up the parts in the self in case we ever eugenically have to, pinpoint where something's a problem so that we can destroy it, right? Um, so this binary stereotypical language, male, female, man, woman, feminine, masculine, is really limiting how we can even talk about the majority of experiences and feelings that a lot of people are having. And then body modifications within the system historically can only be made under duress. That something's actually wrong. So they're still trying to fix you in a sense, right? And that labels, categories, definitions, these are all better to understand in a sense, but also control and limit. And I think that's often we can't see that piece of it. And that it's about rooted in body denial and dissociation. So this framework, because it was rooted and began in trauma, it continues to create trauma and control and pressure. So all of this we're pretty familiar with in contrast to a nature-based way. So really calling in what having this other way of thinking and reorientation, how that plays out then. So this is about focusing on gender diversity, not gender oppression, right? So nature is the primary frame. Excuse me. Body and gender diversity are seen as universal, right? This is perfectly normal. And it's about internal authority and self love, right? Not judgment about how you measure up. It's about acknowledging and celebrating body and gender diversity as a part of infinite and necessary variations. This is actually valuable. A sense of self rises from within through opportunities to explore, not through being told who you are from the outside. The gender wheel, this provides body and spirit as seen as fluid, right? And diverse and nested within one another, not separated out and judged. A language then can reflect that full inclusion. We're going to look more at language with the pronoun protocol next week. And how do we support safety and privacy for gender diverse folks, especially kids, because they have different needs than adults. A lot of times, different formats and ways of being in the world that queer adults even come up with gets laid on to, kids. And it's not always a good fit. It's different because they have different agency, right? They have different experiences. Body modifications are then seen as out of self-love, right? Out of an expression of this deep inner self, instead of something's wrong with you and you have to measure up against something. Language is seen as this changing, evolving thing that we need to kind of use to create equity and kind of get back up to date so that we can include everything and everyone. And this is about body reclamation, right? This is about embodiment. We want everyone to be fully here, which is why we called everyone in at the beginning. How do we be present? And this, because it's tied into nature, actually creates balance and movement and relaxation, right? So we come back into that other kind of imagery that our ancestors were symbolized by, right? All right, so from this place, we're going to go to our second pole. Pole nature-based perspective. So how much do you understand the difference between a patriarchal trauma-based perspective of gender and a holistic nature-based perspective, right? So again, like almost like you have to do that compare and contrast. And I think part of the trick with this work is that it does challenge us to kind of personally pay attention, like where are we? What do we understand? And that's good. That's what we've been trained away from, is that critical thinking, right? And we're calling that critical thinking back in so that it's valuable if we don't completely understand. All right, we're going to end the poll and share results. So again, we're kind of in that sweet spot, that kind of middle ground, that kind of trying to understand, which makes perfect sense. That is really valuable. And it could feel sometimes like it slips away a little bit and then it comes back and then it slips away, which is why nature is so valuable, right? Even like I've been using, I don't know if you can see me, I have my little shark here, using some favorite animal or something to kind of ground you into remembering the continuum and that this is true for all of us. Okay. So now we're going to have you all go into your groups. And yeah, I think this one we're going to do quickly. So how would this shift to a nature-based perspective? Here we start grounding it in, leading into how we teach and talk to kids about gender. Is different when we're talking between ourselves and with grown-ups, right? How do we talk to kids about this kind of thing? All right, and our timeline is so 11:45, so it'll be a little bit on the short side, but give a minute, and then we'll see if y'all have anything to tell me afterwards. Okay. Okay. All right, darlings. Here we go. So I'm just going to dive into this, and then we'll have a little bit of space time at the end if anybody wants to say anything, since y'all are such big talkers. Okay, so here's the overview, right? This is the process, and we're going to keep returning to this and understanding this three-step process and how we move through it. Because this is who we are. This is who we will always be, is infinity. And how do we start bringing that story to our kids, right? Because the gender wheel approach is, I find it very necessary because, to be quite honestly, we're not surviving. I feel like our children are really showing us that they're not surviving the stress and the trauma that our culture provides. That things are getting more intense actually for our kids, and how we can deal with that. That we bring in these three main principles. Again, how do we create this nature base, really provide information again to the people about the reality of everything, really everything around, and how that played out, and then how that played out in relation to how that was suppressed, why there was this whole piece that turned it into this political moral dilemma instead of it just being a normal part of nature, how the tools were used to really put that onto bodies and really control humans in more and more ways, and to focus on reproduction and away from human nature, so to speak, and the impact that has had on how we look at gender now, how we perceive bodies and everything, right? How we have been I think for me, when I pulled in that eugenics piece and I understood how that tied into the United States and control, and that really shifted how I understood how we were looking at gender right now. And that it is through this that we can really have a holistic perspective of gender to really call back in and heal really what's happened in relation to bodies and gender in our culture, so that we can have this full way of dealing with it. So really creating this map in a sense, in order to change how we think in the world, in order to change how we think about ourselves, and change the deeper narrative, that we need to go through this process of understanding, really looking at nature, really understanding those cycles, circles, and patterns, and how that is part of humanity, and then how that has been oppressed quite literally, and how our mind, literally our thinking in a lot of ways, has been changed because of it, and our dynamics away. So we're going to look even more at how to put all of these concepts. It's great to have the big ideas, but I'm a real brass tacks kind of person. So how do we put this into action? So we're going to have the training packet can be downloaded. And then over the next 2 Wednesdays, we'll actually look at things in relation to an action plan. So what can I implement? What feels realistic to me? And what are those tools that I can use so that it feels like you have tools, including on the last Wednesday, we're going to look at popbacks for pushback, which is even talking about how do we hold it in our bodies in a way that feels good, as well as giving over some of the ideas that I've done so much research. Those things to have in your back pocket, when you do hit resistance, to be like, oh, did you know, da 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 da? Well, here's the reality of da da da, here's da da da. So that some of my research can also be your research, and hold on to that. So you get this full sense of how to hold this. And again, because this is the kind of pressure that our kids are under. I was talking to somebody in the breakout, which was so great, is it's not just for our kids, it's also for the teaching we do, but it's also even for ourselves, like creating an environment of freedom to be who we really are. We deserve that, right? That's a really good thing. All right, so again, I want to end for a moment just to see everything all together, so that we can remember the reality of nature, the reality of humans, the reality of what's going on in the world around us. And that the more we become aware of that and what's been done to that, the stronger we can become in ourselves, right? So I want to leave some moments for folks to have questions, comments, since we didn't do a breakout group this last time. Or the
group share.
Yeah, the group share. That's what it was, the group share. So if anybody wants to, and I'm actually going to go back, I'll stop sharing here, and we'll just have humans for a moment. All right.
So you're welcome to come off mute, or welcome to share any questions or comments in the chat.
So in lieu of no one saying anything at the moment, I'm going to throw some stuff in, but do feel free to speak in. Is part of why this is important, I think, for kids, and part of why I find myself really compelled. I get so excited. I actually quite literally love this. I gave this recently, this training, and I was not feeling good. I've been dealing with cancer, and so I've been just like, oh, da da da. But it was the excitement, how much I literally love this story, this perspective. And part of why it's so important to me is not just because I love it, but is because it helps us make sense out of the world. I feel like we're being met with all these amazing kids who are very courageous, who are following their own human nature, who are moving forward, but a lot of times don't know how to make sense out of themselves, or the world around them, and how they fit in, and they feel that isolation. They feel like they're the only one because of all the stuff that's been laid on top of nature. And like, I want my community first and foremost, but also kids, to feel that gravity, to feel that belonging, to feel that weight. And as we look over the next 2 Wednesdays, as we play together, we're going to see that some of that is nonverbal. Some of that is our own comfort, our own understanding, and then how that allows us to hold space for kids in more secure ways, right? And gives us even the critical awareness. So it's not about like memorizing, this identity, this pronoun, this word, this label, and understanding these like abstract kind of like details we're supposed to follow, but literally having tools to understand the world and how to make sense out of it for yourself, and then how to pass that on to kids, right? So that we're all kind of reclaiming what's been denied us for so long.
Hi, I just wanted to jump in and say thank you so much for your thoroughness, for your commitment, your just the research that you've done. I really appreciated the way that you shared with us an intersection of like history and like real examples of like our biodiversity. And it's just really amazing. And I'm still sitting with all of it, but definitely I'm excited to think through how to put it into action and how to share it. So thank you so much.
Right on. Thank you. I think the cool thing too is that it belongs to all of us and we're all connected to it and it connects all of us. A lot of times a lot of the other work that I've done is around peace and healing modalities. And so people often come into this contact with this work and are kind of surprised that it is so inclusive. It's not about division. It's actually about bringing everyone together. And I have to laugh because, of course, the conservatives that have consistently attacked us also are part of the gender wheel, are part of this vision, and are part of the healing that needs to happen. And so, how do we make those connections between everything and create that bigger, deeper healing? Another thing I'm going to just throw out, one of the popbacks for pushbacks ties into the five major religions as well, because they are all sourced pre-colonization. I went back and I found either neutral or positive references to queer, trans, intersex people from all of the five major religions. And so it's this way to also reclaim our spirituality and a lot of the traditions that we have received healings from through, it has roots in places that I think can actually heal some of our spiritual paths so that we don't have to always feel so alienated from some of the traditions in our families. And we can create bridges and we can find ways to heal. I really is that bottom word.
Would anyone else like to share a comment or perhaps a question? You're welcome to unmute yourselves or post it in the chat. Quite sure if Margarita had her hand up or just thumbs up.
Love.
Okay.
Ah,
Well,
sí, solamente di el pulgar para, ya me registré para el próximo taller, gracias.
oh, thank you. That's good to hear. We look forward to seeing you then.
Yay.
We'll just want to take a minute to say, thank you so much, Maya and Matthew, for today's presentation. Thank you all for your participation. We look forward to seeing you folks in the next session. Again, we will be sending an evaluation. We do appreciate the feedback and see you next time. Have a good
Thanks
day.
for having me. Thank you, everybody.